Good morning, everyone. Hope everybody is dry and safe and not located in a flood zone after yesterday's rainstorms. When we discuss the different topics that we talk about here, we don't always reach conclusions. Our goal isn't necessary to give final halakhic psak decisions on certain issues, but to explore topics to make you think about them. One of the topics, which I want to touch on this morning, is the concept of democracy within halakha or within Judaism. To what extent these two concepts can coexist, democracy and I guess halakha, in an ideal world. If we lived in an ideal world, and you wouldn't have to worry about the external pressures of other governments under whose authority we live, a halakhic world might look a little bit different. I would recommend, by the way, I think I may have noted it someplace here. There's a wonderful book, came out a number of years. I actually wrote a review of it. It's called Murder in the Mikdash. It's available on Amazon. Murder in the Mikdash by Gideon Rothstein, very prolific writer, very talented chacham. Murder in the Mikdash. It's about an ABC reporter in Israel who's reporting after Mashiach has come. It doesn't talk about how Mashiach comes. Mashiach is here already. Israel is now totally run under a halachic system. Everybody has to observe halakha. Whether you're religious or you're not, it's irrelevant. The law of the land is halakha. Torah is guides. It's a fact, and they've even written study guides to this book. It happens to be a wonderful murder mystery by itself, but the background, I mean, it is so clever. There was a guy who was a Kohen who was missing a toe. Now he's pasul avoda. He can still eat truma, but he's pasul avoda. But he wanted so desperately to be part of the Beis Hamikdash. So he opened a coffee shop as close as he could to the Beis Hamikdash. It was called Temple Grounds. I mean, it's so clever, and some of the words that they use. Murder in the Mikdash, Gideon Rothstein, get the book, you will not be sorry. It's great reading, and it describes what could be, what would happen in Israel and in other places, I suppose, if the rule of law was the Torah. This topic has been talked about in great length by many poskim, especially in the years right before statehood and after statehood was declared in Israel. Many books and articles were written to show how Israel could run al pi halacha. It's a modern democratic state, but according to halacha. The only problem being, of course, that you had many non-observant Jews and many non-Jews living in Israel, and how it would affect them. But it's a fascinating study. Rabbi Lichtenstein wrote a study about what the compatibility of halacha and democracy. Emmanuel Rackman wrote a whole book on it. Mishpat HaMalucha is a 2-volume sefer about how Israel can run according to halacha. Many, as a matter of fact, I think, Danny, you were involved with Professor Alon a number of years ago, also on a project on Mishpat Ivri, which is not necessarily the same as halacha. The Jewish law is only one part of contemporary Israeli law. Israeli law today is a hodgepodge of British law and Turkish law and Torah law. It's all mixed in together. And occasionally you'll have a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court who is knowledgeable in halacha, and he might guide certain decisions, like Chaim Cohen, for example. Other people like him would guide decisions, with a Torah slant, so to speak, whenever possible. In any event, the term democracy means different things depending where you live. one commonality in democracy is that all the people choose their leaders. That's a democracy. Demos in Greek, ruled by the people. But nevertheless, there are many, many concepts that are not necessarily common in every democracy. For example, there are a number of democratic states in Europe where there's no separation of church and state. There's an official state church, like the Church of England or the Catholic Church in some countries. That is the official state religion, even though it may not play a part in government specifically, but it's very clearly has an impact on how the country is run. Freedom of expression is limited in some democracies. Some limit expressions, free expression that harm others. Some limit expression that even offend others. So there's no one suit fits all. The debate, does freedom of religion must freedom of religion be a part of a democracy? And that's more of a modern question. In Judaism, it would not necessarily be a question. So let's take a look a little bit in history and see what our Jewish sources talk about it. During the time of David HaMelech, is a Davidic monarch. Lo Yosef Shevet mi Yehuda, the tribe of Yehuda, the family of David HaMelech, should rule Israel. Those are the rulers. Is that an ideal form of government? To have a king. All right. Going back to Yaakov Avinu, giving his bracha to Yaakov, to Yehuda. Yehuda will rule. His family will rule. Is that the ideal thing? And if you look in the Torah itself is a little bit ambivalent. In Sefer Devarim it says, Ki savu el haaretz. So first of all, this can only happen when Israel is sovereign in its own country. That's one important note. You're living there, good. The Amarta, and then you should say, Asima alai melech kechol hagoyim. Asher to your side. We want to have a king like all the nations around us. So the people, Hashem recognized the fact that people would like to have a ruler. They look around and see all the other countries have kings, pharaohs, what have you. If people come to you and they say, we want to have a king. So what does Hashem say in the next pasuk? Som tosim alecha melech. You can appoint the king, which Hashem will confirm, and he must be Jewish, etc., etc. And the Medrash Melech below Malka, it should be a king, not a queen, even though we've had a number of queens in Jewish history. Nevertheless, separate discussion. But some tosim alecha melech, you should appoint. Is that a mitzvah by itself? God is saying, okay, it's a mitzvah. You can appoint, you may appoint, you should appoint. There's a big difference between you should or you may. And they argue that question. I'll come back to that. Look further up in Sefer Shmuel. When the elders of the people, the elders came to Shmuel and they said to him, you're an old man, Shmuel. You're not going to be around much longer. You have no sons. And when you do have aren't so hasitatsi, they didn't follow in your ways. Therefore, Sima lanu melech l'shaftenu. We want you to appoint a king to rule over us. You're the last Navi, they thought. Appoint a king for us. Again, kechol hagoyim. So in both Chumash and in Navi, the desire to have a ruler is an imitation of the other nations around us. And what was Shmuel's reaction? Vayera hadavar be'enei Shmuel. He didn't like that idea at all, to give him a king. And he prayed to Hashem, and Hashem said to him, Shma b'kol ha'am. Listen to them. Whatever they want, you should do. They're not objecting to you, Shmuel. They're nothing against you. Kilo oscha ma'asu, ki osi. They are against me, Hashem. They don't want to accept my authority as the rule, the Torah that I gave them. They want a human ruler. So that we have this ambivalence in Tanakh itself as to whether or not there should be a Melech Basar V'Dam. And then the Rishonim discuss whether a king is ideal and how to understand Shmuel's reaction. The Rambam writes that Som Tosim Melech is a positive mitzvah. And he counts it one of the mitzvahs. Again, many interpret it as you may appoint. You don't have to appoint. Ramban says it's a mitzvah. The Ran writes that there are basically, you have two parallel streams in the justice system. You have the Beis Din that enforces the laws as delineated in the Torah, and they are bound by rules of evidence, warning, etc., etc. And the king's function is basically to ensure that society runs in an orderly fashion. That's his job. The king has the right to punish those who evade the legal system, committing crimes, etc. It's a necessary part of governance. And the reason why Shmuel was upset with the people, because they wanted a system where the king had control of the entire system. And the ideal is not to have a king. That's very clear. The reality is people are not always willing to accept the rule of the Torah. And that's why a king, beyond the Sanhedrin's function, was deemed acceptable, not always desirable, but certainly acceptable. But even though it may be inappropriate, a king could defend people, countries. He can marshal an army together. He can establish a system of law. He could punish people. So there is a rule for a king. But clearly, if you if you go back to that book that I told you, Murder in the Mikdash, you see how in the modern times they would implement Torah's laws. Somebody heard, there's a newspaper reporter who heard about somebody who got killed in an accident. And she blamed the person who caused the accident. And she heard that a relative was going to take revenge on the guy who caused the accident. So she goes to the police station and she says, hey, there's going to be a murder committed at such and such a time, such a place. Go out and do something. And the police chief says, sorry. He said, go El Adam. I can't do anything about it. We'll try to prevent it, but if he gets there first, that's the halacha. You know, these are theoretical practices that would happen if you implement the halacha in all areas of contemporary proceedings. The Netziv, more recently, in the 19th century, writes that there's no obligation to appoint the king, but it depends on the times. There are times that people are better off with a democratic government. There are times you need a king to kind of steer the ship of state. It's only a mitzvah to appoint the king. He's medayek. It's a mitzvah to appoint the king if the people really need it, if it's appropriate, in order to guarantee a democracy function. But the Torah is not totally democratic. The people don't vote on the laws. So it's not a total democracy. The Gemara says that Shevet Yehuda's claim to monarchy still exists today. And as a matter of fact, the Reish Galusa, the political head of the Jewish community in Israel and in Bavel, was from Shevet Yehuda. And he was considered not like a king, but he was a titular ruler of the Jewish people. Rav Kook adds something which is very appropriate to our contemporary situation. He says in a brilliant observation, that any ruling body that was appointed by the people to rule over them has the status of melech. Big chiddush. So according to Rav Kook, the Knesset today has the status of a king. They make rules, they can enforce rules. The big fight today is, can they override some of the Supreme Court? How much that separation goes. Can the Knesset by itself declare war? These are interesting questions, but if it has a din of melech, then Netanyahu might be right that they can supersede the Supreme Court. So not that he's having this discussion within a halachic framework, but I'm just raising the issue. A separate discussion we don't have time to go into now is the whole status of the Chashmonaim, who ruled as kings and as they had din of melech and Kohen Gadol, which combined two totally different functions. That's a whole separate discussion. What practically happened in the Middle Ages? There were Jewish communities, the kehilos throughout Europe and Spain and Sephardic countries had communal structures, very, very organized structures, where the community collected taxes, where the community ran its own functioning. They didn't have a melech. They had something called tuvei ha'ir. They had elected governors, if you will, board of governors that passed ordinances and taxation on water allocation, other resource allocation. And you also had rabbanim that got together every so often to make decisions in terms of halacha. It goes back to the Gemara, which talks about Shiva Tuvei Ha'ir, the seven prominent members of the community, I guess you'd call them, Tuvei Ha'ir. And all the Rishonim talk about majority rule because you can't expect unanimous decisions in every matter. You'd never be able to do it. One of the fascinating discussions, however, there are two outstanding authorities in the Sephardic world, interestingly enough. The Rambam and the Rosh. Now, the Rosh was an Ashkenazic rabbi who fled from Germany to Spain to save his life. He was a student of Rambam Rothenberg. He was afraid he would be kidnapped and held for ransom also. So he escaped to Spain. And he had many, many Talmidim in the big yeshiva. He was the chief rabbi of Castile. Many communities determined, they voted, they made a statutory law that in all questions of halacha, we defer to the Rambam. If there's a machlokes, follow the Rambam. The exception to that were the Jews of Castile. We follow the Rambam in all cases, except if the Rosh disagrees. Because that's not the greatest. But again, this was a decision that was made by the community elders, not by the Rabbanim. I mean, later on, the Shulchan Aruch was written. If you look at, and by the way, introductions to Svarim are very, very important. If you read the introduction to the Shulchan Aruch and to the Ramah, the Shulchan Aruch, so basically what they did was, and at least what the Shulchan Aruch says, he took every possible case of halacha that he could, and he had three major poskim that he went to: the Rambam, the Rif, and the Rosh, the Alfasi, and Osher ben Yechiel. When 2 out of 3 agreed, that became the halacha. Then, of course, the Ramah modified it for Ashkenazic practices, but that became the halacha. But the Kehillah system was functioning, I would say, up until the end of the middle of probably the 18th century, probably was when it kind of broke down, the beginning of the reform movement and so forth. But you had communities where they told people, yeah, because of emancipation. But what happened was they used to go around and they collected taxes, not just for the government, but for the function of the community. And they said, you earn so much this year, this is what you're gonna pay. You earn so much, this is what you're gonna pay. They determined, they knew it was small, they knew who was who in the community. They determined your income tax, which went to fix the roads and the wells, and maintain, have candles in the base measure so you can learn at night, and have wine for Abdullah, and so forth. They made that determination. Of course, the Haskalah and the Reformation, and all these new entree of the Jewish community into the general community caused a breakdown of that. There's just so much on this topic. In practical terms, is democracy in Israel today the ideal form, or is it a compromise? And given the fact that it is not strictly according to halacha, we'd have to say it's a compromise. In certain places, for example, things close down on Shabbos. That's it. That's the rule of the clan. However, in some other places, certain things keep on going on Shabbos. In certain, the transportation system in Tel Aviv is not the same as it is in Yerushalayim. They have different rules. Israel is it's the only time in history where you can get a heter to keep a certain business open on Shabbos, if it's vital to national security, or if it takes, or if you have to turn down the turbines or whatever it is, it takes a whole 24-hour cycle to get it started again. These are the issues the rabbis wrestle with, but they don't ask the rabbis, you see. The Kehillah model would be very good for Israel, according to Rav Waldenberg, but the tension is between democratic values and Torah values, and sometimes they come in conflict. There's a lot written about it. Rav Herzog, quotes Rav Nisim, the Sephardic chief rabbi, that certain areas like foreign policy, defense, monetary policy, that can be done as a din melech. Let the Knesset take care of that. But the justice system can function within halakhic parameters. And Rav Chaim Ozer seemed to agree with this and endorsed that recommendation. Rav Herzog had problems with the separation of these two powers. And it's a problem. If you want to have a Jewish state and a halakhic state, an additional problem is the fact that there are many people who don't care for halakha, who are Israeli citizens, who are Jews. The Mehera Yibana have Mikdash, they won't have a choice. But right now, in the modern democratic world, everybody has a choice. Do whatever they want to do. So you can't enforce that model today. The two-branch system, where there are certain things that the halacha can control, other things that the melech, the Knesset can control, seems to be the compromise that seems to work. The UN Declaration, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, says that everybody has a right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. And according to that, you can't impose a halakhic system on modern citizenry. There's a separate discussion we don't have time to get into now about the status of Jews who don't know anything about halakha. Never brought up in a religious system. There was a time in the Israeli system of education where every school child learned Tanakh, they learned a little bit of Mishnah, and even a little bit of Halacha. And there have been attempts to reintroduce this, but they have not been very successful. And as a result, you have a whole generation or two or three of teachers who themselves are unfamiliar with Tanakh and Torah and Halacha.
Well,
That's a big problem, yes.
if I remember correctly, the story of the Peel Commission was that when I believe it was Ben Gurion went to testify, what was his reason for being in Palestine at that time it was called, was the Tanakh itself.
Because Ben Gurion,
So
Ben Gurion
what you're saying, I assume, is that even though that was his justification, they haven't followed up in teaching that through the
But
grade.
Ben-Gurion was a student of Tanakh. He knew Tanakh very well. He knew it almost by heart. He used to quote
Well, that's what I'm
psukim. Well,
saying.
if you ever get a chance to visit Ben-Gurion's house in State Boker and go into his library, he had a shas there. He had all kinds of svarim there. Not that he was observant anyway, but he valued the traditional knowledge, and he quoted psukim all the time.
But my question is, why haven't they continued to teach that up through the grades? So that
Because
doesn't sound
not
like-
not all of his colleagues,
Jewish history
not all of his
started in
colleagues
1940.
shared the same perspective. Most of Ben-Gurion's colleagues in the first, second, and third generation of leadership in Israel were pure secular socialists, and they didn't have that background, and it wasn't important to them. I mean, and you fast forward to 1967, when you had Dayan and Rabin, who were totally secular without any shred of Jewish background or knowledge, to do what they did, giving back Hebron and giving back the Kotel, without any consideration of the implications. I mean, there's a lack of, even in the slightest hush of Yiddishkeit, historical perspective. I mean, it's unfortunate. They say previous generations, people who were educated in Israel in the 40s and the 50s, and even into the early 60s, they knew something that they used to have a course called Masoret, tradition. Whether they observed it or not, they knew something about it. When I worked at Federation, our partner community was Nahariya. And we had teacher exchanges there. Our teachers went there, their teachers came here. And I brought teachers from public schools, to visit some of our Hebrew schools, Reform and Conservative, right? Day schools also to separate visit. Even in the Hebrew schools, the kids knew what Shabbos was. Whether they observed it is irrelevant. They knew what the Chagim were. And the teachers, who were themselves all secular with no religious background, were totally blown away by that, to the point that for several years after this visit, they had the boys from the yeshiva come over on Thursday afternoon to teach their kids Parshat Shavua. And I was able to introduce a Melton course for parents and teachers to learn something about Jewish history and Jewish background. Didn't last very long, but for a while it went on, because there's a thirst for it, but they've never been exposed to it. We tried to unfortunately, the Minister of Education in Israel changes with each new administration. And one year, there was a religious woman who was the Minister of Education, and she wanted to introduce courses in traditional Judaism, history, minhagim, and so forth, to be team taught by a religious teacher and by a secular teacher. And we pioneered a curriculum. We went to a couple of schools to try it out. And unfortunately, the next administration it changed. But I went into a school, I don't know, it was Beersheba, I forget where it was. And an experiment, we tried the curriculum out. And I asked the student, this was a 7th grade class, I asked them, what makes you Jewish? What makes you Jewish? And the answers ranged, I speak Hebrew, I live in Israel, I serve in the army, I eat falafel. That may make you Israeli, but what makes you, they had trouble grasping the whole concept. And the teachers are no better, because they didn't get that education either. So given the fact that in all probability, a 2-tier system is the best we're going to get in Israel now. You have a chief rabbinate, but the chief rabbinate, unfortunately, their power is very limited. They have a Beit Din, and a Beit Din function. There are many people that go to the Beit Din to resolve issues, but you have a secular court system too. You have Toanim in court. You have lawyers who can represent Jews in court and in Beit Din as well. It's interesting, though, that some of the Toanim, some of the advocates, especially in cases of Gittin, you have to take a test to be allowed to represent a client in a Beit Din. You don't have to be a lawyer necessarily. You have to be no halacha. The guy who administers the test for the chief rabbinate once told a bunch of us that women score higher than the men on these tests. So the new generation, it's wonderful, wonderful. But this two-tier system, unfortunately, is the best that we're going to get. From Shimshon Lefor Hirsch writes, interestingly, that if the government tries to regulate belief, that can cause people to rebel against the system. And the best way to achieve justice is through education. And I think he's 100% correct. The halakhic process, in many cases, understands and appreciates the democratic process as well. There's a fantastic halacha here, and it's hard to implement. Mora says that ein gozrim gzeira, Bezdin cannot make a decree if the majority of the people cannot follow it. Interesting. You can't make a psak halacha if the majority of people cannot or will not follow it. Which means power to the people in this context. A minhag can only be established if it's accepted by a majority of people in a community. So the majority, which is a democratic concept, works within the halakhic framework. Again, there are many, many pieces to this, but it's there. It's in the system. And also, if you have a doubt, if you're not sure about a certain minhag, a certain practice, what does the Talmud recommend that we do? The famous expression in Aramaic, puk chazi, go out and look, check it out, visit, see what people are doing. So what people do sometimes influences what they should do. Again, you can't give it a blanket and say that people determine everything, but the fact is that there's no contradiction between the halakhic process and a democratic process, but you simply need the right circumstances in order to implement them both. Yeah.
The majority of the pro people, majority of the Jews looking at it.
I would assume it's a majority of people who are observing the halakha. I mean, the people who aren't observing the halakha doesn't make a difference. They do whatever they want to do anyway. But
it's the people that don't observe.
Almost never. So there's a whole separate discussion we can have about the status of non-observant Jews today, which are in most situations considered to be tinoko shenishbu. They're like children who were captured by pagans and raised in a pagan environment. And you can't blame them for that. And then unfortunately, we have many of our co-religionists who never had a Jewish education. And if they did have it, it was very, very minimal. Everybody looked to the Talmud Torah system following World War II as the great savior of Judaism. Only problem is, most people didn't make it to Bar Mitzvah, and if they did, they went into life with a child's vision of Judaism. They never pursued beyond that. So even those who may have had a smattering of education, the depth and breadth of it was very, very limited. So when you talk about who determines minhagim and who you look to for practices, it would have to be those that follow the practices. If you're not a member of the club, then you don't vote. Put very simply, it's a fascinating topic. People are still trying to do it. One last observation, and then we'll finish up. At one point, Soloveitchik Zatzal was considered for the position of chief rabbi of Israel. And, yeah, in the 30s. And he asked one question. He says, does the chief rabbi have control over Jewish education in Israel? And they said no. So what kind of chief rabbi is it? If you don't control the education of the future, the youth of Israel, but just to be in charge of hashgachos and who's a Jew issue and conversion, that's not being a chief rabbi. That's being a cog in a wheel. And he turned it down.
Go with you.
No.
And then he
Yeah.
goes to, he became the chief rabbi of Boston, and he established all the educational network in Nevada Rabbanim, and all the other things that he did when he was in Boston.
Walk there.
Although he didn't establish an ARIB because he didn't believe you could have an ARIB. Whole separate discussion. In any event, there's a lot more to be discussed about this topic. I urge you to read the book Murder in the Mikdash. You will enjoy it thoroughly, and it'll touch on some of these concepts of democracy within a halakhic system, and to what extent it does or doesn't exist.
You understand English?
Okay, these are only Rosh Hashanah. I'm just giving you headlines. Each of these topics can be gone into in greater detail. Okay, any questions, comments, criticism? Okay, good. Have a wonderful day.
You too. You too. Shiur.
Thank you, Wally.
Also.
Yes. Okay.
Okay.
After bed, shall I? My dessert. Birthday cake, breakfast. Levy. You're a Levy. We have no Kohen here, do we? How about you?
Sign of a.
Yishem le baruch me'atav yad olam. Rosh Hashanah shlot v'chayinu. Who's to vote? Tell me. Good to see you. Or
so nice you would appreciate this. First, they had a student who put up a Hanukkah light show, and he observed Shabbat, so he didn't have it, of course, on Friday night. So it's a beautiful Shabbat code. And his mother said something so nice, Mrs. Solomon. She said that even when the notified was the light of our respect to love gives us unity and
it's very nice.